A little bit of smack talk over video games at a Crowley, Texas home erupted into deadly violence in August of 2024 when a man pulled a gun and fatally shot a teenager named Tavian Swindle. During the game, Swindle and 35-year-old Devon Jones engaged in what initially seemed like some harmless back-and-forth banter, but Jones apparently took Swindle's commentary personally and pointed a gun at his young friend's chest. Unfortunately, the weapon discharged, leaving Swindle dead and Jones facing a murder charge. Jones was arrested in Fort Worth later that night. For the time being, he remains behind bars at the Tarrant County Jail, with bond set at $260,000. In addition to 1 count of murder, he's facing an evidence tampering charge. Speaking with local station WRDW shortly after Jones's arrest, crime prevention spokesperson Michelle Morgan acknowledged that there are still a lot of questions surrounding the case and, more specifically, what led up to the shooting. She explained in her own words that from a crime prevention standpoint, Swindle's death could have been avoided if the family had undergone conflict management. But as they say, hindsight is 20/20, and it's unfortunately too late to undo what's been done. Number 13. The murder of Cara Welsh. An up-and-coming nationally ranked gymnast and college student from Plainfield, Illinois, will never see her full potential because her life was taken from her during the last weekend of August in 2024. 21-year-old Cara Welsh was shot 8 times while lying in a fetal position inside her boyfriend's apartment near the University of Wisconsin's Whitewater campus. Police have identified 23-year-old former University of Wisconsin wrestler Chad Richards as the culprit. Richards reportedly admitted to shooting Welsh but claimed that he was acting in self-defense when he pulled the trigger. Officers arrived at the scene just after midnight and found him crying hysterically in the apartment building's hallway. Inside, they found Welsh's lifeless body lying in a pool of her own blood. According to Richards' version of events, he and Welsh got into a heated argument, which caused him to become so frustrated that he punched a wall. He claimed that Welsh grabbed a gun from his nightstand, leading to a struggle between them over the weapon. As soon as Richards had the gun in his possession, he fired repeatedly. He's been charged with first-degree intentional homicide and is currently awaiting trial from behind bars at the Walworth County Jail. Number 12. Crimea Baker and Shawn Lang. In what can only be described as a scene straight out of a horror movie, 4 terrified children hid inside their bedrooms as their parents were mercilessly slaughtered inside the family's home along a quiet cul-de-sac in New Market, Maryland. The horrific crime occurred early on a Sunday morning in August of 2024 when the killer snuck into the residence at around 1:30 a.m. and shot 33-year-old Crimea Baker and 34-year-old Shawn Lang in cold blood. None of the kids were physically harmed, but they were so terrified that they continued to hide for nearly 6 hours after the double murder. They finally sought help after daybreak, and the entire community was left shaken by the discovery of the victims' bodies and the disturbing nature of the homicides, including seasoned members of law enforcement. Crime scene investigators determined that the killer had fired at least 42 rounds at Baker and Lang at close range. Frederick County Sheriff Chuck Jenkins described the incident as a targeted rage killing by an angry, enraged person. According to the most recent available updates, no arrests have been made and law enforcement is actively working to identify and arrest the person responsible for the victims' deaths. In the meantime, the children are receiving the support they need from social services and the community. Number 11. Julia Edler. On a Saturday night in July of 2024, a teenager named Julia Grace Edler dialed 911 and pleaded for help at her family's Palm Bay, Florida residence. Police arrived to find Edler's mother, 41-year-old Kelly McCollum, and McCollum's boyfriend, 22-year-old Matthew Sejnrock, dead from multiple gunshot wounds. Additionally, Sejnrock had been stabbed multiple times. Much to the surprise of investigators, The forensic evidence at the scene, including bullet casings and blood droplets, suggested that Edler was not a terrified witness, but that she was the perpetrator. She now stands accused of murdering her mother and Sejnrock in cold blood and is in custody as she awaits the outcome of her case. According to authorities, Edler was motivated to commit the double homicide by her sheer hatred toward McCollum for dating a man nearly 20 years younger than her. 3 months prior to the murders, Sejnrock was arrested on suspicion of battery in a domestic violence case involving McCollum. The case was ultimately dropped and Sejnrock was permitted to move back into the home that McCollum and Edler shared. Detectives claimed that on the night of the killings, Edler killed the victims with a .38 caliber handgun and a kitchen knife, then dialed 911 and blamed the violence on a home intruder. She initially claimed that she hid in her room with her dog while the murders were carried out, but inconsistencies in her story, in addition to the physical evidence, caused police to repeatedly question her version of events. Not to mention, the murder weapons were found outside Edler's bedroom window, further pointing toward her involvement in the crime. Edler eventually admitted to killing the victims and making up the story about the home intruder. In addition to disapproving of her mother's relationship with a younger man, she explained that Sejnrock was not very accepting of her gender transition. She further explained that she stole McCollum's gun prior to committing the murders and lay in wait for her mother and Sejnrock to arrive home, indicating that the crime was planned rather than something that occurred in the heat of anger. Edler gave a detailed confession which described how she first killed McCollum before turning the gun on her mother's boyfriend, who tried to hide in the bathroom and then begged for his life. She claimed that Sejnrock was in such agony from being stabbed that he pleaded with her to put him out of his misery, a request she was apparently happy to honor. The outcome of the case remains to be seen. Number 10. Anthony Jimenez. In July of 2024, a 26-year-old Illinois man named Anthony Jimenez was accused of stabbing his girlfriend, Jessica Reyes, to death during an argument at their home in Villa Park. The young man's mother reportedly walked into the room as the violence unfolded, but was unable to stop her son from killing Reyes. After murdering the victim, Jimenez dialed 911 and confessed to the crime. He was still covered in blood when responding officers arrived at the scene and was promptly handcuffed and taken into custody. At the time, Reyes was still clinging to life in a back bedroom where emergency responders found her in a pool of her own blood. Immediate life-saving measures were taken, but Reyes succumbed to her injuries despite paramedics' best efforts to save her. According to reports, the couple got into a verbal argument that morning at around 8 a.m. Jimenez refused to let Reyes leave the apartment, so she climbed down to the parking lot from the third-floor balcony in order to escape, but she didn't go very far because Jimenez caught up to her and managed to persuade her to go back inside. Not long after that, another disagreement broke out between the pair. This time, Reyes attempted to gather her belongings with the apparent plan of leaving the apartment, but once again, Jimenez was determined to stop her. He pulled a knife from his pocket and stabbed her repeatedly, plunging the blade into her body 12 times as she fought for her life. Jimenez was charged with murder following his girlfriend's death and is currently awaiting his next court date from behind bars at the DuPage County Jail. Number 9. Kenneth Cond. The identity of Boeing instructor Dorothy Silzel's murderer was an enduring mystery for more than 40 years. After the 30-year-old was found dead in her Kent, Washington home in February of 1980, police discovered her body while performing a welfare check 3 days after she was last seen alive. The medical examiner who performed Silzel's autopsy concluded that she had been assaulted prior to her murder. She died from strangulation and also suffered blunt force trauma injuries to the head. And while the killer left biological evidence behind, DNA technology was in the very early stages of its infancy, and decades would pass before it became a commonly used investigative tool among law enforcement. In 2022, police were able to obtain a DNA profile from the evidence, but it did not match with any of the convicted felons in the country's CODIS database. Using a groundbreaking technology called genetic genealogy, an expert matched the sample to 11 possible suspects who were all first cousins with one another. In September of 2023, authorities narrowed their sights on a 65-year-old man named Kenneth Cond, who was now living in Arkansas. Police in Washington contacted law enforcement in Arkansas and learned that Cond was already under investigation for a more recent assault. Police had already interrogated Cond about the assault, and they noticed that he put every single one of his cigarette butts in his pocket in an apparent attempt not to leave any DNA behind at the site of the interview. In early 2024, officers traveled from Kent, Washington to Arkansas and stealthily followed Cond until they saw him disposing of a cigarette butt in a public place. They surreptitiously collected the butt and tested it for DNA. Lo and behold, it was a perfect match to the DNA of Silzel's killer. Investigators have found no prior connections between Cond and Silzel, but they discovered that a relative of Cond's lived near the victim when she was murdered. Cond also worked in Washington the year Silzel was killed. This, coupled with the DNA evidence, was convincing enough for prosecutors to move forward with a murder case against Cond. He was taken into custody in August of 2024 and was awaiting extradition to Washington, according to the most recent available updates. Number 8. Mary Ann Hayes. When a suburban mother named Mary Ann Hayes was found dead in her Northfield, Illinois home in 1996, police were quick to rule out foul play. The incident was chalked up to an unfortunate tragedy, but questions lingered in the minds of some skeptics, and a team of experts now suspects that Hayes was killed in what's been dubbed a hidden homicide. Based on their findings, the team believes that a murderer fatally strangled Hayes and then staged the woman's death to make it appear as though no foul play was involved. Moreover, they have accused local law enforcement of failing to ever treat the case as a crime and ignoring evidence pointing toward the possibility of such. The same team of experts has also raised concerns about the death of Mary Ann's son, Stephen Altman, who passed away 12 years prior to his mother in 1984. 21-year-old Altman was found dead at his stepfather's place of business, but much like in Mary Ann's case, investigators were quick to rule out foul play. They decided against opening an investigation into the case based on Altman's history of mental illness, and no autopsy was performed. While examining the circumstances surrounding the death of the young man, who was asphyxiated with a ligature, the experts noticed possible signs of foul play, and they are now wondering if the authorities were too quick in their decision not to investigate further. One of the team members told local station WGN-TV that they had never seen such a complex ligature in a case that did not constitute a death at the hands of another individual. Moreover, the presence of more than one ligature mark on Altman's neck further points towards someone else being involved in his untimely demise. The team urged law enforcement to reopen both cases, but it's unclear whether they have any actual plans to do so. In the meantime, the deaths of Hayes and Altman remain shrouded in mystery, leaving their loved ones without the answers they've spent decades longing for. Number 7. The murder of Michelle Lee Williams. 28-year-old Michelle Lee Williams worked for the U.S. Postal Service in the Chicago area, but she lost her life outside the notoriously crime-ridden city in the suburb of Orland Park. She met her fate by gunfire while sitting in a car in March of 2024, and no immediate arrests were made after the mother of three's body was found inside the bullet-riddled vehicle. A step toward justice was finally made in September of 2024, following months of investigation, when police announced the arrest of 3 suspects in connection with the case. 29-year-old Kyron Williams of Chicago was taken into custody in Las Vegas on a first-degree murder charge. He has since been extradited to Illinois and remains in custody as he awaits trial. 28-year-old Tyshan Boyd is facing charges of possession of a stolen motor vehicle and unlawful use of a weapon by a felon. A third accomplice, 20-year-old Alexis Hernandez of Crete, Illinois, was charged with obstructing justice. While a law enforcement spokesperson failed to go into detail regarding each suspect's alleged role in the crime, the charges seem to suggest that Kyron Williams is the accused shooter. Authorities also declined to go into detail about a suspected motive for the murder, leaving the case shrouded in mystery for the time being. Number 6. Triple murder in Texas. The Harris County, Texas community of Cypress Mill Park was rocked by an unspeakable act of violence in August of 2024 when a local residence became engulfed in flames. Inside, emergency responders found the bodies of 54-year-old Kelly Maschiarelli, her 23-year-old son Colin Foster, and Foster's living girlfriend, 21-year-old Cameron Richard. Based on the evidence at the scene, investigators theorized that all 3 victims were dead before the house was set ablaze. There are also suspicions of a deliberate arson, including evidence that an accelerant was used to start the fire. A neighbor reportedly heard a car door slamming during the early morning hours, and there were also reports of a red Chevy Corvette sitting outside the residence around the same time. But investigators have not revealed who they believe may be responsible for the alleged triple homicide. The police also declined to elaborate on whether they believe anyone else was living at the residence at the time of the incident. According to the most recent available updates, law enforcement is diligently working to solve the case and bring the person responsible for the victims' deaths to justice. Number 5. Douglas Otterson. In early April of 2024, police in Crystal Lake, Illinois, took a missing persons report regarding the disappearance of 57-year-old James Cromwell. Based on their initial findings, detectives quickly surmised that Cromwell had most likely met with foul play. Further investigation led law enforcement to properties in neighboring Kane County, where they found Cromwell's remains about a month after he was reported missing. An autopsy revealed that he had been shot to death. Investigators connected the crime to 61-year-old Douglas Otterson, who is now facing charges of first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, unlawful possession of a weapon by a felon, unlawful possession of ammunition by a felon, aggravated unlawful restraint and concealment of homicidal death. Records show that he's being held without bond at the Kane County Adult Justice Center as his case works its way through the court system. His alleged motive for killing Cromwell remains unclear. Number 4. Ronnie Devontae Scott and Nicole Clark Crocker. 24-year-old Donnie Glover had recently graduated from college when he was shot to death in Pearland, Texas, in February of 2021. Shortly before he was killed, Glover dialed 911 and reported that he was being followed by 2 suspects who were trying to steal his vehicle from an apartment complex parking lot. During the call, the dispatcher overheard gunshots. Sadly, by the time police arrived at the scene, Glover was dead. Witnesses told investigators that they saw a man dressed in all black at the scene. He fled in a red vehicle that was being driven by someone else, but there wasn't enough evidence to pinpoint any suspects. In the immediate aftermath of the crime, the wheels of justice finally began to turn more than a year later. In June of 2022, when 27-year-old Ronnie Devontae Scott and 21-year-old Nicole Clark Crocker were charged with capital murder in connection with the shooting. According to police, additional details about the crime had come to light, enabling them to identify and charge the suspects who killed Glover in a botched attempt to steal his new car. Text messages revealed that Glover was pursuing Nicole Clark Crocker romantically while she conspired with Scott to commit the robbery. At the time of Glover's murder, Scott was out on bond in connection with 2 unrelated aggravated burglary cases, leading some to wonder why he was allowed to roam free in the first place, given the seriousness of his existing charges. But he won't leave prison anytime soon because he pleaded guilty to murder in 2024 and is now serving a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Following Scott's sentencing, officials declined to go into detail about the status of Crocker's case. Number 3. Jason Penrod. During the summer of 2024, 47-year-old Florida attorney Jason Penrod abruptly shuttered his family elder law offices in and around Winter Haven. 2 months later, he was arrested in Polk County on suspicion of squandering several of his clients' trust funds to the tune of $4 million and counting. During a press conference, Polk County Sheriff Grady Judd explained that his agency received its first 2 complaints about Penrod over a 4-day period in late July of 2024. Just days earlier, in early August, an additional complaint was filed with the Pennsylvania State Police by a brother and sister who accused Penrod of siphoning the $1.7 million inheritance that their father had left in the crooked attorney's care. According to the complaint, Penrod not only admitted to the siblings that he had squandered their trust fund, he personally flew to Pennsylvania to tell them in person. He reportedly admitted to having a gambling problem, which he blamed on post-traumatic stress disorder and repressed memories of a difficult upbringing, and he promised to pay the money back with interest. Further investigation revealed that several more victims from neighboring counties had accused Penrod of wrongfully pilfering their funds, bringing the total amount of allegedly stolen funds to $4 million and counting. In addition to stealing from his clients, he reportedly drained his own personal accounts and stole from family. So far, Penrod has been charged in Polk County with 1 count of felony grand theft, which carries a prison sentence of up to 30 years in the event of a conviction. He initially agreed to surrender his license to practice law, only to reapply based on the argument that he can't make money to pay his victims back if he can't work as a lawyer. The excuse failed, and law enforcement has made it clear that they are going to do their best to send him to prison for a very long time. During a press briefing, Sheriff Judd mentioned that several of the complaints against Penrod are still under investigation. Whether or not he'll face additional charges remains to be seen. Records show that he was released from the Marion County Jail 4 days after his arrest. Today's topic was requested by Sandra Chevelle 2137. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Ashley Benfield. The once seemingly picture-perfect relationship between former ballerina Ashley Benfield and her wealthy and much older husband, Douglas Benfield, began in 2016 when the two met at a political event. At the time, Ashley was 24 years old and Douglas was 54. The couple tried to establish a ballet company in Florida, but the business failed and it wasn't long before Ashley became pregnant. She soon moved to Bradenton to live with her mother and shut Douglas out of the child's life despite his best efforts to be an active father. A contentious child custody dispute ensued and the situation devolved into a complete nightmare from all angles. The marriage came to a tragic and murderous end in September of 2020 when Ashley fatally shot Douglas at her home in Bradenton, Florida, in what became known as the Black Swan murder case. Prosecutors charged Ashley with murder and accused her of wanting to live off child support as a single mother, while the young woman's defense attorneys argued that she was terrified of Douglas. Ashley claimed that she killed her 58-year-old husband in self-defense after suffering from years of spousal abuse. In July of 2024, a jury found her guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter after deliberating for 6.5 hours. Her attorney made a last-ditch effort to get her acquitted post-conviction, but the attempt failed. Ashley is due to be sentenced in late October and is facing up to 30 years in prison If you thought these American suburbs weren't bad enough, imagine how worse it can get down under. Stay tuned till after number 1 because we've got our previous release of When Australia Goes Wrong coming right up. Number 1. Robert Crio III. A mass tragedy struck the US in 2022 when a gunman opened fire on a crowd during a 4th of July parade in Highland Park, Illinois, leaving 7 victims dead and numerous others hurt. Sadly, many people believe that the massacre could have been prevented and that there were warning signs that went ignored. The suspected shooter, 21-year-old Robert Crio III, was reportedly flagged by authorities for threats of physical violence and other troubling behavior as far back as 2019, 3 years before the shooting. Police confiscated numerous weapons at the time, including 16 knives, a dagger, and a sword. After the massacre, Lake County Major Crimes Task Force spokesman Chris Covelli said that law enforcement ran into roadblocks with their previous investigations into Crio, including a lack of statements signed by witnesses. Additionally, Crio had made disturbing social media posts glorifying mass shootings, which also apparently flew under the radar. In June of 2024, Crio backed out of a proposed plea deal that he had previously shown a willingness to enter. Under the terms of the agreement, he would plead guilty to all 7 murders and 48 counts of aggravated battery in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Crio initially refused to speak during the hearing and was rolled out of the courtroom in a wheelchair. He was later wheeled back in and simply said no when the judge asked him if he wished to move forward with the plea deal. Left with no other choice, the judge set a trial date for February of 2024. The outcome of the case remains to be seen. On the morning of October the 26th of 2023, the body of 21-year-old Lily James was found at St Andrew's Cathedral School, a prestigious private learning facility in Sydney's CBD. James had suffered devastating head injuries which were later determined to have been inflicted with a hammer. James, a water polo instructor, had dated her killer, 24-year-old Paul Tyson, for about 4 weeks. Tyson would later be described as a narcissistic psychopath by criminal psychologist Tim Watson Munro. The expert suspected that Tyson had killed James driven by his inability to accept her decision of ending their relationship. Tyson, a former hockey instructor at St Andrews, lured James to the school's gymnasium by asking her to return some of his sports equipment. He drove a borrowed Lexus to the location, and earlier CCTV had captured him buying a hammer at a hardware store not far from his Kensington home. Footage from surveillance systems at St Andrews showed the man following James into a gym bathroom at around 7 p.m. on October the 25th. At some point, he bashed her head in with the hammer. Tyson left the area about an hour later while the young woman never emerged. Tyson called the police about 4 hours after the killing and told them where they could find the body. The call was traced to The Gap Clifftop at Diamond Bay Reserve in Vaucluse. Tyson, whom Watson Munro suspected had begun panicking at the thought of serving a lengthy prison sentence, would never face justice for James's murder. His battered and bloated body was recovered at the Diamond Bay Reserve and later identified in a Sydney mortuary. Number 22. Incident at Perth Zoo. In the summer of 2023, a confrontation between an American tourist and a kangaroo at a Perth zoo went viral on TikTok, amassing over 2 million views. The unnamed tourist's daughter captured the fight, which had begun after the marsupial had approached another visitor. The daughter, who laughed as the brawl unfolded, noted, "My dad was just trying to make sure that kangaroo stopped getting frisky with that lady." The juvenile kangaroo rose to its full height as it clawed and kicked at the tourist, who nervously kept it at bay with his leg and pushed it away by the throat. A younger man entered the fray, but he was also attacked. Both men tried to hold the kangaroo's paws, but it reared up on its muscular tail and kicked at them with its legs. It then pursued them as they tried to retreat. A zookeeper eventually intervened, and the altercation, which had lasted roughly 2 minutes, came to an end. Among the flood of jokes that poured in from social media users, many also praised the tourist for keeping his composure and calmly dealing with the situation. One Australian user wrote, Well done. What a great way to handle our national emblem in a non-natural environment. Thank you for your kindness and patience. Number 21. Dinush Carrera. CCTV from a home in the Melbourne suburb of Sandhurst showed a teenager banging on her neighbor's door and pleading for help after her mother had been stabbed on December the 3rd of 2022. The teen was recorded saying, "He's cutting her with a knife. He's like full on bashing her with a knife." The neighbor rushed to the home of 42-year-old mother of three, Nalomi Pereira, and found her dead in a pool of her own blood. Her teenage son had also suffered a critical knife wound to the neck, but he survived after receiving emergency surgery. Roughly a year prior, Pereira had separated from her husband of 2 decades, 45-year-old Dinush Carrera. He was arrested at the scene and charged with her murder. Updates from April of 2023 indicated that in spite of the damning evidence and witness testimony, he'd pleaded not guilty. Number 20. Incident in Cabra matter. Soon after it was uploaded in January of 2023, the video of a street fight in Cabramatta, southwest Sydney, went viral. The combatants, a driver and a pedestrian, weren't identified, but the altercation had reportedly begun after the former honked at the latter while he was crossing the street. They proceeded to swing at each other with sticks in what the media jokingly dubbed to be a Harry Potter fight. One of the men ducked and grabbed a bigger branch, while his opponent tried to walk away. The latter was pursued and again swung at. In the moments that followed, a third man eventually separated them and the duo walked off in separate directions. Among the commenters reacting to the situation online, one wrote that it was a sticky situation, while another criticized the men's behavior and labeled it childish, while wondering, where are their parents? Number 19. Rajwinder Singh. 24-year-old Toya Cordinley went to Wangeti Beach, located at a 40-minute drive north of Cairns, on October the 21st of 2018. She'd gone to walk her dog, Indy, but failed to return. Her family went to the beach with torches to try and find her in the aftermath. Indy was discovered tied to a tree, unharmed, but there was no sign of Cordinley. Police and local search and rescue teams looked for the young woman, but it was her father who eventually found her lifeless body, half buried in the sand, not far from where Indy had been tied up. Cordinley had been stabbed to death, and the primary suspect was identified as Rajwinder Singh, a man in his late 40s. Singh boarded a flight to India, leaving behind his job, his wife, and 3 children the day after the victim was reported missing. While in India, he was reported to have moved through various locations to evade arrest. He was clean-shaven in Australia, but he grew a beard and donned a turban while on the run. In November of 2022, Queensland police offered the equivalent of nearly $700,000 for information leading to the man's capture. After announcing the reward, they received numerous tips, and within weeks, Singh was arrested while visiting a doctor in New Delhi. Indian media reported he'd told local police that he'd killed Cordinley following a row about Indy barking at him. Singh waived his right to challenge an extradition order and was taken back to Australia in February of 2023 to face court. Singh maintained his innocence, and as of late October of 2023, hadn't entered a plea. Number 18. Danny Zayat. 34-year-old Tatiana Dokutaru phoned the emergency services in Liverpool, Sydney on May the 26th of 2023. But the call abruptly cut off because, as investigators later determined, her phone had been thrown out of a window. A few days prior, Dokutaru had sent loved ones a clip which showed her with a black eye, believed to have been inflicted by her estranged partner, 28-year-old Danny Zayat. The couple's relationship was described as turbulent and toxic, and in May of 2022, Dokutaru had taken out an apprehended violence order against Zayat. Nevertheless, she reportedly invited him to her home where her son was present on May the 26th of the following year. An argument erupted close to midnight, and neighbors would report hearing someone running through the building's hallway screaming, "Help me!" Dokutaru was able to contact law enforcement but didn't give the specific location of her unit, and responding officers couldn't find her in the building, which had 297 units. Roughly 18 hours after the initial call, the police located her lifeless body inside her home. The woman had been beaten to death while her son was present at the unit unharmed. Zayat was found with Dokataru's body, but he claimed to have left the unit at around midnight, following an argument about the woman's alleged drug use. He said that he returned in the morning when he couldn't contact her. The amateur bodybuilder was subsequently charged with 22 domestic violence offenses for incidents in which he choked, assaulted, stalked, and intimidated Dokataru. Over a period of 2 years leading up to her death, he was bailed out in July, following an investigation lasting until late August of 2023. The police built a case against Zayat and arrested him for Dokataru's murder. Number 17. Tck Jot Singh. In March of 2021, CCTV captured 20-year-old Tck Jot Singh at a Bunnings in Mile End, buying gloves, cable ties, and a shovel. Singh was setting in motion a revenge plan against his ex-girlfriend, 21-year-old Jasmine Kaur, following the breakdown of their relationship. The police had cautioned him for stalking Kaur the previous month. Singh drove to Kaur's workplace at the Southern Cross Care Aged Care Home in North Plympton, in the western suburbs of Adelaide. Singh abducted his ex, then bound, blindfolded, and gagged her before driving her to a spot in the Flinders Ranges nearly 250 miles from her workplace. A judge would later argue that the woman must have been terrified, as she was forced to suffer through the uncertainty of her fate during the drive, which took several hours. Singh then dug a shallow grave and buried Kaur inside while she was still alive. Prosecutor Carmen Mateo would later paint a vivid picture of the woman's final moments, stating she must have been consciously suffering what could only be described as the absolute terror of breathing in and swallowing soil and dying in that way. Following Singh's arrest, he denied murder but ultimately pleaded guilty, and in the summer of 2023, he was sentenced to 22 years and 10 months in prison. Number 16. Jenna Allen. While helping her community during the 2014 floods, Victoria woman Jenna Allen ended up with her hand in a box and felt something bite her. Allen discovered that the culprit was the highly venomous redback spider, also known as the Australian black widow. Historically, the redback has been responsible for more cases of envenomation requiring anti-venom than any other Australian creature. Allen started crying upon being bit, and the initial pain was followed by vomiting and loose motions. She was going through the symptoms commonly associated with the spider's potent and potentially deadly neurotoxic venom. Allen was rushed to a hospital, but unfortunately, it didn't have redback anti-venom. She was then transferred to a general ward, but her wound became necrotic and rapidly deteriorated. A specialist in Bendigo subsequently removed the damaged tissue and replaced it with a skin graft from Allen's thigh. Within a year, the woman, who was at the time in her 20s, started developing mosquito-like bumps on her graft. A doctor determined that the venom had triggered an immune response, causing her body to reject the graft. The condition would torment Allen for more than 8 years, and she required constant specialized care. She at one point faced amputation after her entire left forearm had become a mass of infected sores and ulcers. Allen had to spend an estimated $1,300 every week to dress her wounds, a process requiring a long list of specialized products, medications, and bandages. The treatment wasn't covered by Allen's insurance, and a GoFundMe meant to help Jenna beat the bite was started for her by a friend. Updates from December of 2022 indicated that the mother of two was still battling her condition. Number 15. Gable Tosy. Australian man Gable Tosy had started talking to 26-year-old Warriana Wright through Tinder before they decided to meet in person on August the 7th of 2014. Wright, originally from New Zealand, was on the Gold Coast Surfers Paradise on vacation. The pair went to Tosy's home on the 14th floor of Avalon Apartments in Surfers Paradise. They drank heavily, took selfies together, and had intercourse. Tosy, a self-confessed womanizer, had a habit of recording his dates, and the audio files would become an important piece of evidence. At around 2 a.m., a fight broke out between the two, as Wright had become increasingly aggressive and erratic. The row, partially captured on Tosy's phone, indicated he'd tried to restrain her, and a choking-like sound was heard on the recording. He then told the woman
"You're lucky I haven't chucked you off my balcony," before threatening to knock her out. Wright repeatedly shouted out no and that she wanted to go home. Tosy then locked her on his balcony. Moments later, Wright tried climbing to the balcony below, at which point she slipped and fell to her death from 14 stories. Tosy reportedly tried to call his lawyer prior to notifying the authorities and was later arrested. The prosecution argued that he'd intimidated Wright to the point that she felt the only way she could escape him was by climbing down the balcony. The defense maintained that he'd merely tried to calm down her violent outbursts and wasn't responsible for what happened next. In the end, he was acquitted of both murder and manslaughter charges, in what some viewed as a failure of the Australian justice system. In the aftermath, Tosy would legally change his name to Eric Thomas, under which he made a new Tinder profile.
Number 14.
Killer crocodiles. One of Australia's most dangerous apex predators is the saltwater crocodile. The species, popularized by Steve Irwin's Crocodile Hunter series, is the largest living reptile on Earth and owns the most powerful bite ever measured in the animal kingdom. Predominantly found in the country's north, saltwater crocs will actively pursue humans as prey, and there's virtually nothing that an unarmed person can do to oppose it. Exceptional specimens can grow beyond 20 feet and weigh up to 3,000 pounds. In 2003, 3 friends went quad biking at an abandoned mine beside the Finniss River. As the men were cleaning the dirt off their clothes, one of them, 22-year-old Brett Mann, was swept away by swollen waters from a recent typhoon. Mann's friends tried to swim towards him, at which point they encountered a 13-foot-long saltwater crocodile. It clamped its jaws on Mann's shoulders and dragged him away. The other 2, both aged 19, climbed into the nearest tree. A few minutes later, they saw the crocodile emerge from the water with Mann's body in its jaws. The massive beast continued to stalk the tree that the men were in for most of the night and through the early hours of the following morning. Fortunately, after hours spent in fear and darkness, they were airlifted to safety.
Number 13.
Ivan Milet. Ivan Milet is often referred to as Australia's most terrifying serial killer. From 1989 to 1993, Milet murdered at least 7 backpackers in Belanglo State Forest in New South Wales. He approached hitchhikers, introducing himself as Bill, and offered to give them a ride in his car. Milet then held his victims at gunpoint and took them to the forest, where he incapacitated and murdered them, often in gruesome fashion. Milet used one of his victims, a 21-year-old British backpacker named Caroline Clark, for target practice and shot her in the head 10 times. The body of Clark's companion, Joan Walters, was found in the same area with 15 knife wounds. Milet would often stab his victims in the back, often delivering his strikes with such force that they would sever the spine. A German couple, Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschied, both in their early 20s, were last seen in December of 1991. Their remains were discovered 2 years later. Milet had shot Neugebauer in the head 6 times, while Habschied was decapitated, and her head was never found. Milet was apprehended in 1994 after backpacker Paul Onions managed to flee and later positively identify him. Milet was sentenced to life in prison for 7 murders, but he's believed to have claimed more victims.
Number 12.
Killer spiders. Most of the images of Australian spiders that become viral on social media will feature a huntsman spider that has made its way into someone's home. This is chiefly due to the arachnid's exceptional size, as its leg span can reach up to 12 inches. Its ferocity, however, is mainly a myth. The species does possess a venomous bite, but there are other spiders far more dangerous than the huntsman. The Sydney funnel web spider has large fangs that enable it to strike repeatedly and latch onto its target. It owns extremely powerful venom, with a neurotoxin specialized in attacking the nervous system of primates. Historically, the redback spider, also known as the Australian black widow, has been responsible for more envenomation cases than any other creature in Australia. If left untreated, bites from the Sydney funnel web and the redback can be deadly. However, the discovery of antivenom has greatly limited fatalities. In April of 2016, Jaden Burley became the first person in Australia to die from a spider bite in nearly 4 decades. The 22-year-old had been bitten by a redback and was hospitalized for a 4-day period, during which he had surgery to drain an abscess under his arm. He was released with antibiotics but died from complications 2 days later.
Number 11.
Murder of Stacy Mitchell. In 2006, teenager Stacy Mitchell ran from home to live with 19-year-old Valerie Parashumti and 21-year-old Jessica Stasinowski. Mitchell had only known the couple for a few days when she moved in. Before long, jealousies arose, and Stasinowski accused Parashumti of flirting with the 16-year-old. In an attempt to prove her loyalty to her girlfriend, Parashumti decided to kill Mitchell. Her lawyer would later argue that she had a severe personality disorder and an obsession with vampire subculture, stating that she'd been drinking human blood since she was a child. On December the 18th, the three of them drank whiskey together. Parashumti then repeatedly struck Mitchell in the head with a concrete block, and Stasinowski strangled her with a dog chain. The pair reportedly kissed over Mitchell's body and filmed her on a cell phone as she lay dying. They disposed of her remains in a wheelie bin, where they were later discovered by the police. Both were arrested, and during the ensuing trial, it was reported that they smiled, giggled, and whispered at each other. Parashumti and Stasinowski were sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 24 years served.
Number 10.
Murwillumbah bank robbery. One of the most infamous heists in the country's history took place on November the 23rd of 1978 at a bank in Murwillumbah. Before opening hours, the robbers broke in through the back door and used an electromagnetic diamond-tipped drill to crack open the safe. After taking nearly $2 million, they cleverly locked the safe door. An expert locksmith failed to open it, and a construction crew was called to make a hole through the building's brick wall. After a bank manager had finally gained access to the inside of the safe, he told the police they got the lot. This would become a famous slogan around Australia and in other parts of the world. The culprits, known as the Magnetic Drill Gang, were never captured, and the money was never recovered. They were suspected of having committed a string of bank robberies in Sydney and Melbourne, using their signature tool, while unconfirmed speculations on the mastermind behind the Murwillumbah heist fell on Graham the Munster Kinniber. He was Victoria's most influential gangster at the time. A reported perfectionist, he was said to have practiced safecracking in a warehouse prior to the heist. Kinniber was never charged, and in 2003, he was killed in a gang-related shooting.
Number 9.
Killer snakes. Australian fauna is infamous for some of the world's most dangerous snake species. Native to the country's central semi-arid areas, the inland taipan owns the most potent venom of any snake. A single bite is toxic enough to kill up to 100 adult humans. It's not, however, as willing to engage and prefers to escape potential threats. The eastern brown snake, also extremely venomous, accounts for roughly 60% of the country's snake bite fatalities. Second to it is the tiger snake, named so for its banded body, which will respond aggressively to threats and inflict a highly venomous bite. In 2020, 78-year-old Winston William Fish died after being repeatedly bitten by a tiger snake. A neighbor found him after Fish's dog had raised the alarm. The elderly man was still conscious and squeezing the serpent's head after it had latched onto his right hand. The rest of the tiger snake's body was coiled around Fish's arm up to his neck. The neighbor chopped the serpent's head off, and Fish was airlifted to a hospital. He was given anti-venom but ultimately succumbed to multiple organ failure, brought on by severe envenomation.
Number 8.
Martin Bryant. Australian man Martin Bryant is one of the deadliest mass shooters in modern history. In April of 1996, he killed 35 people and injured 23 others in Port Arthur, Tasmania. A psychiatric evaluation performed after the massacre indicated that Bryant was borderline mentally disabled, with his IQ equivalent to that of an 11-year-old. In the late 1980s, he began working as a handyman for a lottery heiress, whom he befriended. In 1992, she died in a car accident. Bryant was inside the vehicle, and it was suspected He'd caused the accident due to his known habit of lunging for the steering wheel. As the sole beneficiary of her will, Bryant inherited the heiress's estate. After becoming a wealthy man, he reportedly began stockpiling firearms. On April the 28th, when he was 28 years old, he started his killing spree by shooting the owners of an inn, reportedly motivated by a past conflict in which they bought the property that his father had wanted. He then drove to the historic site of Port Arthur where, after eating at a cafe, he pulled out a semi-automatic rifle and opened fire. Within 2 minutes, Bryant killed 20 people. He would claim more victims before stealing a car and returning to the inn with a hostage. It was there that he had a standoff with the police, who tried negotiating his surrender. At some point during the negotiations, Bryant executed his hostage. In the morning of April the 29th, he started a fire in the inn and was captured as he attempted to flee in the confusion. He never gave a motive for his actions, but mental health specialists speculated it was due to a desire for notoriety. Bryant received 35 life sentences plus 1,035 years. In the aftermath of the Port Arthur massacre, the Australian government placed extensive restrictions on all firearms.
Number 7. Jordi Huna. Jordi Huna was traveling through Western Australia's Midwest region on March the 18th of 2022 on her way home to Pinjarra when she was brutally attacked by a man who'd reportedly been stalking her. 20-year-old Huna had first taken notice of the suspicious individual at about 5 p.m. after stopping at a roadside store off Northwest Coastal Highway. She drove for another 3 miles before pulling into a parking bay. It was at that point when the man approached her and began repeatedly asking for her phone number. When Huna indicated that she didn't want to disclose that information to him, the stranger became hostile. The young woman reached for a knife that was located in her car door, but her stalker launched his attack before she was able to grab it. He reportedly beat her unconscious and dragged her underneath her vehicle where she remained for roughly 5 hours until a passing truck driver noticed her. Upon having water poured over her face, Huna regained her senses and managed to drive herself to Jurien Bay Hospital. As of the latest updates on the case, her attacker hadn't been identified, but he was described as being in his 30s or 40s and having dirty blonde hair. Number 6. Jose Merlos and Nikki Wong. A couple driving through a remote section of the Australian outback became stranded on January the 3rd of 2021 after their car got stuck in the sand. According to subsequent reports, Jose Merlos and his fiancée, Nikki Wong, had been traveling on rural back roads while returning home from a vacation to Cairns. After their vehicle had become disabled, the couple were forced to continue the journey on foot. They reportedly left a handwritten note in their abandoned car indicating that they were walking to Inaminka, a small town near the South Australian border. Over the course of the next 2 days, Merlos, Wong, and their dog Loki trekked nearly 25 miles in the scorching heat, relying on a preloaded map due to the lack of cell phone reception in the area. In a statement to the Royal Flying Doctor Service, the couple revealed that they were forced to drink dirty water from a cattle trough as well as their own urine to stave off extreme dehydration. Then on January the 5th, Merlos and Wong finally encountered a motorist on the secluded roadway who drove them the remaining 15 miles to Inaminka. As was later detailed by a nurse practitioner from the outback, the temperature during the time in which they were stranded had been about 20 degrees cooler than the typical annual average. If the weather had aligned with the usual January temperatures, the couple would have likely died before being rescued. Number 5. Peter Falconio and Joan Lees. A pair of British backpackers went missing on July the 14th of 2001 after they'd gone on a hike in a remote area of the Stewart Highway near Barrow Creek in Australia's Northern Territory. One of the tourists, Joan Lees, re-emerged in the early hours of the following morning when she flagged down a road train driver who took her into town. Lee subsequently went to the Alice Springs police to report that she and her boyfriend, 28-year-old Peter Falconio, had been attacked by a stranger who'd been following them as they traveled along Stewart Highway towards Devil's Marbles. The man had gestured for the couple to pull over to the side of the road. After they'd done as indicated, he allegedly claimed to have witnessed sparks shooting out of their van's exhaust pipe. Falconio went to the rear of the vehicle to investigate while Lees sat in the driver's seat, ready to rev the engine on his signal. The woman then heard a gunshot ring out from behind the van
after which the stranger jumped into the passenger seat and held her at gunpoint. He reportedly bound Lee's hands and feet before also taping her mouth and then dragging her to his car. While the gunman was preoccupied with attempting to move Falconio's lifeless body out of the road, Lee's fled into a nearby bush. The attacker searched for the woman, coming within inches of her position on 3 separate occasions, before ultimately giving up and leaving the area. The authorities launched a search for Falconio, whose body still hadn't been recovered as of the latest information available of the case. In 2003, investigators identified Western Australia resident Bradley John Murdoch as the individual responsible for Lee's assault and Falconio's presumed murder. Following a trial before the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory, Murdoch was found guilty of the charges levied against him and consequently sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 28 years. Number 4. Phu Tran, Tamara McBeath Riley and Claire Hockridge. 3 Australian citizens disappeared after going camping in the outback near Alice Springs on November the 19th of 2019. It subsequently emerged that Phu Tran, Tamara McBeath Riley, and Claire Hockridge had been reported missing by family members on November the 23rd. 3 days later, Northern Territory Police launched an air search for the missing trio that primarily focused on areas near Owen Springs, Stewart's Well, and Rainbow Valley. The extensive search effort failed to yield any results for the first 10 days. Then on December the 1st, McBeath Riley was found by a rescue helicopter east of Stewart's Well. As the woman later told investigators, she and the others had become stranded after their car had gotten bogged down in the Fink River. McBeath Riley added that her 2 travel companions had set out to find help after they'd run out of supplies, but added that she hadn't heard from them for several days. Then on December the 2nd, Tran was found by a cattle farmer who'd gone to look for the missing hikers after hearing about the situation on the news. 40-year-old Tran, who'd survived by drinking groundwater, was taken to a local hospital. A couple of days later, the police came upon Hockridge's remains in the Northern Territory outback. It later emerged that the trio's ill-fated hike had actually been a drug smuggling operation gone wrong. An official investigation into the matter uncovered that Tran, McBeath Riley, and Hockridge had traveled into the outback on the day of their disappearance in order to recover methamphetamines that they'd previously hidden in a remote section of the countryside. Number 3. Reg Fogarty. A 62-year-old man embarked on a hunting trip in the remote West Australian goldfields on October the 7th of 2015. The West Australian police force would later reveal that Reg Fogarty had last been seen at a campsite roughly 100 miles east of Laverton. Fogarty subsequently got lost, reportedly while hunting for a camel, and his family declared him missing the following morning. He remained missing for almost a week until on October the 12th, tactical response group trackers began finding footprints he'd left behind. They eventually came upon Fogarty under a tree about 9 miles from the campsite. The man was said to have been extremely dehydrated and delusional at the time of his rescue. Upon being transported to a Kalgoorlie hospital by the Royal Flying Doctor Service, Fogarty's condition was reportedly stabilized. According to subsequent reports, the wayward hunter had relied on the consumption of black ants for his survival, which the authorities deemed miraculous, given the dearth of food and water at his disposal. Number 2. Paddy Morati. On the evening of December the 16th of 2017, an elderly resident of the small Northern Territory town Larimar went missing along with his dog. Paddy Morati had last been seen leaving the town pub on his quad bike. In the days that followed, local authorities organized extensive searches, and Northern Territory Police also offered a $250,000 reward for pertinent information that might lead to Moriarty's recovery. Despite the large-scale rescue effort, Moriarty was never found, and investigators thus began suspecting his presumed death in the outback had been precipitated by foul play of some kind. It subsequently emerged that the 70-year-old man had been entrenched in a long-standing feud with a neighbor of his named Fran Hodgetts. The latter had called the police a few months before Moriarty's disappearance to report that the plants in her garden had been poisoned. She blamed Moriarty outright for the occurrence, but she was unable to provide any evidence in support of her allegations.
Nevertheless, the incident had caused tensions between the two neighbors to escalate dramatically. According to a 2022 inquest into the matter, the police had captured secret recordings made between January and June of 2018, in which a man had allegedly confessed to murdering Moriarty and his dog. The individual in the audio was identified as local resident Owen Laurie, who'd worked for Hodgetts in the past and had gotten into a verbal altercation of his own with the missing man. In the wake of the inquest's findings, Coroner Greg Kavanagh referred the case to the Director of Public Prosecutions, who was tasked with deciding whether criminal charges could be pursued against Moriarty's neighbors. Number 1. Kate Ellen Alford. In September of 2020, Kate Ellen Alford had been out drinking with colleagues at the Springshore Hotel in central Queensland when she decided to drive them back to the cattle station where they worked. Court records indicated that one of 19-year-old Alford's colleagues had expressed concerns regarding her ability to drive while she was obviously intoxicated. Nevertheless, the young woman set out on the 80-mile trip through the Queensland outback with Amory Pilgrim, aged 23, in her passenger seat. It was later reported that neither of the women had fastened their seatbelts upon getting into the car, an aspect which ultimately proved disastrous when Alford lost control of the vehicle. She had been filming a video for Snapchat and consequently hadn't been looking at the road in front of her when she mounted the dirt shoulder, clipped a tree, and rolled the car several times. Pilgrim was flung from the vehicle and Alford ultimately found her unconscious roughly 65 feet from the crash site. Alford fruitlessly attempted to perform CPR on her workmate, who was later pronounced dead after having suffered multiple catastrophic injuries. The police tested Alford's blood alcohol content, which was determined to have been above Australia's legal driving limit at the time of the deadly incident. She was taken into custody and charged with several offences, including dangerous operation of a vehicle leading to death. Upon reaching a plea deal with prosecutors, Alford was given a suspended sentence that only jailed her for a period of 3 months. Thanks for watching. Which American city would you least like to be forced to move to for the rest of your life, and why? Let us know in the comments section below.